Mabuhay. When I say mabu, you say hi, mabu. Mabu. When I say mabu, you say hey, mabu. Mabu. All right. I'm a little overwhelmed right now with emotion. I feel your energy, and I feel such positive aloha right now. I also feel the energy of so many of our ancestors, our manongs and manangs who are with us today. And I felt it from the second I stepped on campus today. And I just want to honor that right now, you know? I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. I'm so grateful for the trailblazers who've been instrumental in me being able to be where I am today. I met Manang Amy for the first time in my life, and I've been citing her for the past 20 years. And to know that, you know, we're all in this space because we care about the success and the thriving of Filipino Americans in academia and higher education is something that's so profound because 20 years ago or 30 years ago when Pamantasan was just starting, you know, it was just a dream. It was just something that people thought would be important, but maybe didn't realize what you were capable of doing. And so to see all of you all here in this room is just something that is truly phenomenal for me. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about my story, talk a little bit about where I've been in terms of my own experiences as a Pinoy, as a Filipino American in academia and higher education, not to just share what I've been through, but things that I know that many of you have been through as well. And for the younger people in the room, I hope that understanding the stories that I share as well as that the stories of others who share today, that you're able to take from them, you know, this idea of what is possible, to know that there are people who have fought hard to get to where we all are today, and it is also part of your responsibility to continue that work and that legacy. And so today my topic, or my title of my presentation, is This is What a Professor Looks Like on Achieving Your Ancestors' Wildest Dreams. And part of this theme is related to a project that my good friend Dr. Sylvia Masula and I started a few years ago, and it's called #This is What a Professor Looks Like. And one of the reasons why we created this social media campaign was because we were tired of seeing the images of what professors look like. If you go on your phones, not right now, but if you go on your phones and you Google professor, you'll see images of all older white men in tweed jackets. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to show that not all professors are white, not all professors are men, not all professors even own a tweed jacket. And for us to see that if there are people who look like you and people who love like you and people who have similar experiences as you, and you see them in these roles as professors, as politicians, as educators, as entrepreneurs, as artists, as community leaders, then you know that this is something that you can be. There's a famous phrase that we often turn to, and it's, we can't be what we don't see. And so we need to be more visible. We need to show our future generations of the possibilities. And I hope today I can at least open a little bit of that door for some of you all in the audience today. So these are 3 or 4 professors. One is me. But I chose some of the images of some of the Pinoys and Pinays in our room, or who participated in the campaign. So this is Dr. Janet Stickman, Mendoza Stickman of Stockton of Napa Valley Community College, E.J. David of University of Alaska, Ernabel DeMillo of St. Peter's University in New Jersey. We also have, where do I point this? I could also. Are you sure? Okay. We also have Dr. Crystal Saldanha of the CUNY City University of New York, Dr. Alicia Bell Prado of the Wright Institute in Berkeley, Dr. Anthony Ocampo at Cal State Poly Pomona, and Dr. Gabe Garcia at the University of Alaska. And so again, showing that this is possible, that you can be a professor too, you can become a community leader, you can become an activist, that even if you don't know anyone that is currently in those roles, to know that this is a possibility. Okay.
It works now.
Oh, it does now. Okay.
To the left.
Left. Is it on? Oh, it's not on.
Okay, never mind. I'll do it.
Okay. It's also important for me to honor the people who come before me, the ancestors, the manongs and manangs, who fought hard for me to be able to have all the opportunities that I have today. Their very presence of fighting for their rights to live and to survive is an act of revolution. Some people were able to do things like lead protests and marches and strikes that led to our ability to have the civil rights that we have today. Others had the audacity to live their most authentic and truest selves in order for me to be able to live as my most authentic and truest self. So I pay homage to people like the Manongs, Manong Philip Vera Cruz, Manong Galeria It Leong. I pay respects to my queer people of color and queer trans people of color who were able to live their most truest and authentic selves, people like Audre Lorde and James Baldwin, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson. I also honor all Indigenous people for whose lands we are merely occupying. So people like Wewa, people like the Indigenous people here in Hawaii, people who are protecting the Mauna at this very moment. We are here because we are merely occupying their lands, and we need to make sure that we respect indigeneity and that we remember that this isn't where we are only here because we are now occupants of this land. Next, please. I also have to always pay respects to my mentors. When I was an undergraduate student, I didn't know what graduate school was. In fact, my first mentor in my undergraduate program, Dr. Jeanette Castellanos, she pulled me aside one day after class, and I was taking an ethnic studies class, and she says, "Kevin, I would like to speak with you after class." And for many students of color, if a professor wants to meet with you after class, you think you're getting in trouble. And in reality, she pulled me aside to ask me what I was doing after I graduated. And I said, "I don't know. I'll probably just, get my certificate to become a substitute teacher. That was my goal in life. I don't know why. I didn't even aim to become a regular teacher. I was like, I think I'll just be a substitute teacher. That was what I wanted to do, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but that was what I knew was possible. And so she said, I think you should go to graduate school, and I literally replied to her with, what's graduate school? And she said, it's where you can go and get your master's degree or your doctoral degree. And I said, I don't want to become a doctor. And she says, no, not a medical doctor. You could get your doctorate in philosophy. And I said, well, I don't think I can do that. I don't think I'm capable of that. And she said that she believed in me. So she did everything short of fill out my applications for me. And I got into a master's program, eventually got into a doctoral program because I had a mentor who took a chance on me, who saw something that I didn't even see myself. And so I honor her. When I was in my master's program, I met another woman named Dr. Alfie Breland who saw that I could achieve a doctorate. I was getting my master's degree in counseling, and she says, I think it's time for you to go get your doctorate. And I said, I don't think I can do that. I'm not smart enough for that. And she says, I think that you have so much to offer and that you want to continue to do work for Filipino Americans, and getting a doctorate is a way that you could do that. And so again, she pushed me and she mentored me, and she made sure that I was able to apply to these various doctoral programs, and I got in. once I was there, I met Dr. Daryl Wing Su, who many of you might know as the founder of multicultural psychology. When he was a student in the 1960s, he began to see that psychology focused mostly on white American experiences. And so he advocated for multicultural studies in psychology. He founded the Asian American Psychological Association, and his work eventually led to multicultural competence across many helping professionals, including psychology, social work, education, and so forth. And so with his mentorship, I saw what was possible. I saw that I could become a professor, that I could attain my doctorate, and that I could become what I would later refer to as a scholar activist, somebody who is not just doing the work to be able to do research and to understand and advocate for the betterment of the world, but somebody who can do so in advocating for my communities. And so I honor my mentors because without them, I would not be here today. Next slide. I especially want to honor one of my mentors, my sister friends, someone who we lost too soon, Dr. Dan Boholano Mabalon. She was an associate professor of history at San Francisco State University. She was a trailblazer, a fighter, a comedian, a poet, a friend. She was the national historian or national scholar for the Filipino American National Historical Society. She was a historic preservationist, somebody who fought for the recognition of Little Manila and Stockton so that Little Manila could be preserved. She was somebody who wanted to tell the stories of Filipino Americans. Her most recent book focused on Larry Itliong and told the story of Larry Itliong in a book that is aimed towards children, so that children could have heroes that they could look up to as well. Her work on the Larry Itliong book with Gail Ramosanta has led to a series of children's books that will present Filipina and Filipino American heroes and sheroes to future generations. Her seminal book, Little Manila's in the Heart, documents the history of Filipino Americans in the early 1900s in California and understanding how they advocated for civil rights, which led to some of our labor laws today. And so Dr. Dan Boholano Mabalon is somebody who we should all aspire to be like and whose honor, whose memory and legacy we should honor by continuing to tell our stories. Don used to say that Filipino American history is American history, and American history is Filipino American history, and that we need to make sure that if people aren't telling our stories, that we need to make sure that we tell our stories. Today is October 18th, 2019. It is the anniversary of the first Filipinos landing in the United States, or what is now known as the United States, which was October 18, 1587. So somebody do the math, that's 330, I had it, but I forgot. I'm not great at math. But over 300 years ago, Filipinos came here to what is now known as the United States. As a result of that, the Filipino American National Historical Society has recognized for the past 30 years, Filipino American History Month in October. So to clarify, it's Filipino American History Month, not Filipino American Heritage Month, not Philippine History Month, not Philippine Heritage Month. It's Filipino American History Month. It's the month where we recognize the significant contributions of Filipino Americans in the United States. It's understanding our experiences with struggle and racism and discrimination, and making sure that future generations know that Filipino Americans have contributed significantly to the fabric of the United States. It's understanding that Filipino Americans first landed here in 1587, that they've formed communities in the bayous of Louisiana in the mid-1700s, that they came to Hawaii in 1906 and worked as cicadas in sugarcane plantations, plantations, that they also came to California and the Pacific Northwest and to Alaska in the early 1900s and worked as workers in salmon canneries or on the fields in the farm workers in Delano and Stockton and nearby areas. It's understanding that the Filipino American farm workers were the first to strike, which led to the United Farm Workers Movement, which then led to the boycott of 1965 of grapes, which then led to the labor laws that we have today. It means understanding that Filipinas have been instrumental in making sure that our communities have stayed strong and that we continue to persevere. We understand that our Pinays, like Vicky Manolo Draves, who was the first Filipina and first Asian American to receive a gold medal representing the United States when she won for diving. We recognize Pinays like Dr. Dorothy Ligo Cordova, who founded the Filipino American National Historical Society and organized in the 60s and 70s, ensuring that Filipino Americans' voices were always represented. We remember people like Dr. Ping Serafica, the first Filipina to become a tenured professor of psychology in the United States. She got her doctorate here, went back to the Philippines, formed the first Filipino American children's mental health hospital, and then came back to the US and became a tenured professor. We remember people like Thelma Buchholz, who was the first elected Filipino American state legislature in Alaska and in the country. And we remember all of our Filipina American mothers and lolas and nanays and ates and manangs and titas and aunties who have made us what we are today. So this month, Filipino American History Month, has been designated by FONS as Filipina American Herstory Month to make sure that we honor Filipino women who have been the backbone of our society. So let's give a round of applause to our Filipina American women. And we need to recognize Filipino American History Month because if we don't, who is going to? And we need organizations like FONS because if we're not being told our stories through the mainstream US American history books, that we need to make sure that our stories are told. So I invite you all in July to join us at our biennial conference in Honolulu, the July 15th through 18th at the Marriott Waikiki Resort. And it's the 18th biennial conference of the Filipino American National Historical Society. Hundreds of Pinoys and Pinays from all over the country will be here. I would love for you all to welcome us all and show us that aloha spirit, and also for you all to come to learn more about Filipino and Filipino American history. We'll have an opportunity for people to present and to propose conference presentations, and we'll also have opportunities for people just to tell our story. For everyone in the room, sometimes it might be easy or it might be common for people to feel like my story isn't that special or my family's story isn't that special, when in reality, your story is part of history. Everything you do now will be part of history. Everything your family did was part of history. When your parents or grandparents immigrated to the United States, they did so in search of better life and opportunities, and that's part of history. So it's really important for us to not just remember how much our history is important, but also how necessary it is for us to tell those stories to future generations. So by the end of today, if you don't know the history of your parents or grandparents who came here to the United States or to Hawaii, I implore you to call them on the phone and say, I need to learn more about how you came here, why you came here, what were the circumstances in which you came here, because that is history, and that needs to be documented, and that's something that needs to be passed down to future generations. A lot of historians will say things like, without history, we don't know where we came from. Jose Rizal has a famous quote of one who does not know where they came from will not reach their destination. And we also know this a common quote is, no history, no self, no history, no self. It's important for us to know our history and to understand our stories so that we can then use that knowledge as a way of understanding ourselves. One of the reasons why it's so important for me to continue advocating for Filipino Americans is because I have learned about my history. Like most Filipino Americans and most people of color, my story does not begin with me. My story begins with my parents and my grandparents. My lolo and lolos on both sides were from the Visayan Islands in a province called Aklan. Anyone from Aklan? Come on, not one of you? Aklan, represent? All right. But in the province of Aklan, they lived in poverty. They lived through war. My parents were children during World War II. They were there when Japanese airplanes dropped bombs on their villages. They were there when the neighboring town was slaughtered and that thousands of people were killed by soldiers. They hid in caves to avoid being killed. They have the historic trauma of avoiding violence and seeing their kababayan be inflicted by violence. They carry that with us, and I carry that with me because it gets passed down across generations. We might not talk about it all the time, but it doesn't mean it's not there. It means that through the trauma that we experience, that it is something that moves through us, not just spiritually and not just transgenerationally, but also psychologically, and more modern research shows metaphysically or through genetics. And so we need to understand that trauma and need to understand how that trauma affects all of us. And in order to heal, we have to name what that trauma is. And this is why we need to know our histories. My parents chose to come to the United States in the 1960s. My mom first came in 1962 when she was a registered nurse and she was recruited to work at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. When my mom came to the United States, there was still a quota of 100 Filipinos that were allowed to come to the U.S. Prior to that, there was a quota that only 50 Filipinos could come to the U.S. on an annual basis. So when we look at current situations and current events, we recognize that history is repeating itself. That even though Filipinos might not be affected by immigration bans or immigration policies that prevent us from coming to this country, that this is part of our history. That for about 30 years, Filipinos were limited in how many people could come to this country. So if you see how many people are in this room today, I think there was over 100 people, that this is way more than the number of Filipinos that could come to the U.S. Prior to the 1965 Immigration Act of 1965. So we need to know our history so that we can then advocate for others who are now going through the same things that we had gone through. It might not affect us. It doesn't mean that we also don't know what that's like. And we need to understand the privileges that we have if these laws do not target us because there was a time when they did. And so recognizing that history is something that is really important for me. My parents moved here essentially in search of the American dream. They wanted their children to have the things that they did not have growing up in provincial Aklan. My parents grew up during a time of war. My parents grew up without running water. And so they sacrificed everything that they could have so that their hypothetical children could have a better life. Now, I want you all just to kind of sit with me, and some of you who are immigrants in the room know exactly what I'm talking about. But they came here with the possibility of their hypothetical children having everything that they didn't have. They did not know very many people that had already come. In fact, they were among the first who came in the 1960s. So they gave up the opportunity to live comfortable lives in the Philippines, where they would be surrounded by people that they knew and loved, where they'd be surrounded by things that were comfortable for them, so that they could give a better life to their children. They didn't have Facebook or MySpace. Why did I say MySpace? I'm so old. They didn't have Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and they left with a possibility that they would never see their families again. They didn't know that they would ever see their families again, but they sacrificed all of this so that their potential children that weren't even born yet would have a better life. I don't know if I have what that took to make that sacrifice. And so I thank them, and I hope that you all thank your parents and grandparents who may have made similar decisions. I grew up here in the United States. I was born and raised in California. Anyone from California? All right, you could be louder. Anyone from California? Awesome. So I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the East Bay. Anyone from the East Bay? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Oakland, Fremont, no. All right, and I grew up as a Filipino American kid. As a Filipino American kid, I was somebody who learned what it meant to be Filipino and American. Having Filipino immigrant parents meant that I learned about Filipino culture and food, and I learned how to dance the tinikling at a very young age, maybe before I was even walking. And I learned to and loved being Filipino. But I was also an American kid. When I went to school, I spoke completely English. I learned to like the same types of things that my classmates liked. I watched Saturday morning cartoons. I did everything that any other American kid needed to do. But I also learned how to be bicultural. To be bicultural means to balance those two. It means to sometimes know that in some places you might need to be more American, in other places you might need to be more Filipino. It means learning how to code switch or switch between the situations and environments that you're in. Knowing that when I'm among Filipinos, I have to monopole my elders, while knowing that when I'm with my friends, I could be loud and rambunctious. Being Filipino American also means that you can be both and all at the same time. It means when I go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, I never eat at the restaurant because you need to go home and eat it with rice. And that is being Filipino American. Next slide. I grew up with my Filipino American family. I was the youngest and obviously cutest of 3 children. But being Filipino American meant that I was proud of being Filipino. I knew I had brown skin. I knew that that my parents came from the Philippines, and that they instilled in me the values of what most Filipinos instill: to respect your elders, to value education, to make your parents and your families proud, and to never bring hiya or shame into our families. And so these are all very positive things that helped me to persevere and to do well in school. But it was also sometimes felt like a pressure that because I wanted to make my parents proud, that if I didn't do well in school, that I may have felt bad about myself, or if I didn't do well in sports, or if I did something that would embarrass them, that I would feel ashamed. And so being a young boy meant that I had to adhere to gender role norms. As the youngest of 3 boys, I learned that I needed to play sports, that I needed to be macho or masculine, that boys weren't allowed to cry, and I needed to fit in. So even though I preferred to do things like pretend I was a solid gold dancer on the right, or that I was a runway model on the left, I call this fierce and fabulous 4-year-old. that I learned that that was wrong, that it was something that would bring hia to the family. That was something that I could not be because I could potentially shame my family and make them not proud of me. And so I struggled throughout my childhood and my young adulthood with coming to terms with my sexual identity as a gay or queer person, so much to the point that I contemplated suicide, that I contemplated just running away from my family and never seeing them again, because it was that real and that powerful. Because of this, I turned to a lot of negative and unhealthy things because I didn't know how to cope with being different, and I didn't have any role models about how to be. And so I say this because it's really important for us to understand that we need to be able to support young people, not just queer and trans people, but also others in our community who may struggle to fit in, people who are told they're not Filipino enough, our multiracial siblings who are told that they're not Filipino enough, people who are different and think outside of the box and don't adhere to the status quo of being Filipino, that we need to support each other so that we all know that we are included and that we can all be part of this community. As a teenager, and this is where I'm like my 90s realness comes in. This is when I had hair. I also have an earring on the left ear. But as a Filipino American youth, I started to learn more about my identity. I started to understand what it meant to be Filipino. It meant having Filipino American friends who I could relate to because we understood each other's parents and understood each other's family and community dynamics. It also meant dealing with racism for what would be the first time. It meant for me as a Filipino being followed around in stores by store clerks or being pulled over by police officers for no reason, and then being accused of being in a gang because I had a Filipino bumper sticker. It meant things like not being presumed to be smart in comparison to my other Asian American peers who were encouraged to go into the honors classes while I was not. My high school was 50% Filipino, but in my honors classes, there were only 3 of us. And why is that Filipinos weren't encouraged to do well? Was it because we weren't smart enough, or could there be a systemic reason for this? During my teenage years, I also learned that Filipinos tend to historically create bonds with Black and Latino communities in a way that other Asian Americans did not necessarily. And so I formed alliances with friends who were Black and Latino and Pacific Islander because we could relate with each other. And this is where I started to learn that being Filipino was unique or different, and where I started to identify only as Filipino, and where I didn't identify as Asian American because Filipino identity was most important to me. Next, when I was in my 20s, I struggled with being gay to the point that I never thought that I would be deserving of love. I never thought that I could potentially find love. I didn't really ever think that being gay could lead to happiness. For at least a decade or 2 of my life, this was something that I truly believed. And it wasn't until I met my husband, this is a picture from our wedding day, that I realized that this was possible. That even though I didn't have any queer, trans role models, that I could become somebody who could show others that it was possible. My husband likes to say that he is the second luckiest man in the world because apparently I'm the luckiest man in the world. But I say that because if we're not taught that we can love, and we're not taught what a healthy relationship looks like, and we're not taught that we're deserving of love, how are we going to learn that? And so I find myself always feeling lucky that I have been able to not just become successful in my career, but someone who's been able to become successful in my personal relationships. I easily could have become a statistic. Filipino Americans tend not to go to to graduate school or pursue their doctorate education. Filipino Americans are still highly underrepresented in academia. That a recent study by Dr. Dina Maramba and I found that there are only 100 tenured or tenure-track Filipino American professors in the United States, and out of those, only 20 are full professors. And so to know that that was a statistic that I could have become somebody who did not pursue higher education. But also as a queer person, especially a queer person of color, queer people of color are likely, significantly likely to die by suicide than heterosexual straight people. Queer people of color are also likely to become infected by HIV/AIDS, which then could lead to their demise or their deaths. Queer people of color, particularly in the 80s and 90s, queer people of color are also likely to be to come in contact with the criminal justice system, which then prevents them from succeeding. And so I feel very lucky to be here today, and it's something that I need to recognize as I continue on my journey. I have been fortunate enough to be the first in many ways. I'm the first in my family to get a doctorate. I'm the first in my family to attend an Ivy League institution. I was the first in my family to write a book. I was the first in my family to become a professor. I was the first in my family to be able to succeed in my career in a way that I'm able to travel to places like this. And I feel very fortunate for that. But I say all of this not because I'm trying to gas myself up, but rather because it's a problem that in 2019, I'm still the first to do all these things without having a second or third and fourth in sight. That there need to be more Filipinos who are authors. There need to be more Filipinos that are in academia. There need to be more Filipinos who are making their marks in the world, but yet there aren't. And so how can we enhance the opportunities and the possibilities for future generations? And maybe things like this are one way that we could do so. I was fortunate enough to speak at the White House in 2016, so the good White House. And I share this photo. And I share this photo because when I think about my parents' struggle, living in war and poverty in the Philippines, coming to the United States with literally just 2 suitcases and their dreams, and me being able to speak at the White House is really a symbol of their American dream. And so when I am able to do anything, I don't just think about myself and my success. I bring my parents and my grandparents, my lolos and lolas with me, because it's because of their struggle that I'm able to be who I am and have the opportunities that I do. It was really important for me to make sure that with this power and this responsibility came the opportunity for me to advocate for the people and communities that I care so much about. When I was in the field of psychology, first as an undergraduate student and then as a graduate student, I realized that there was hardly anything written by Filipino Americans. And so I easily could have been somebody who said, like, I guess that's just the way it is, but I couldn't. That if something isn't there, maybe you have to be the one to create it. And so I took what I could from the existing trailblazers like Manang Amy and other psychologists like Manang Ping Serafica or Manang Lenny Strobel, who paved the way for me. And I decided to continue that work and that legacy and advocate for our people. So I wrote the first book on Filipino American psychology in a comprehensive way in the United States. I've also written books on LGBTQ issues, on gender, and again, I'm not saying all these things merely to boast, but rather because there's so much more work that needs to be done. I never in a million years thought I would write books, but now that I've been able to, I hope that others can see that they can do so as well. I became a full professor in 2016, and this is a selfie from the moment I found out I became a full professor. You can see the joy in my eyes. And I say this because there are 20 full Filipino American full professors in the United States. 20. The number may have gone up to 25, but at last count there were 20 full professors. We need to have more of us represented at the table. At a place like UH and House EC, where our population is the largest ethnic group out of all the students, and you have only a handful of Filipino American professors, that's a problem. And this is why you need to advocate for more professors and advocate for student activism. So I'm supposed to say something inspirational. So something inspirational goes here, but I thought, like, what else can I share with you all? So I thought I would give you some, next slide, some unsolicited advice for how we can collectively come together and make the world a better place for our communities. So first off, one is learn your history. October is Filipino American History Month, but we should really be celebrating Filipino American history throughout the year. We need to read books like America's in the Heart by Carlos Bulasan and Little Manila's in the Heart by Dr. Don Bobohala Mabalon. We need to understand our history, and next, we need to fight for our history. We have to recognize that ethnic studies needs to be integrated into our systems. Ethnic studies has been around for at least 50 years, started at San Francisco State University, and we need ethnic studies because it saves lives. Ethnic studies is oftentimes the first time that students of color hear about themselves in the classroom. And so when you don't have ethnic studies, people don't learn about the history of our people. They don't learn about struggle and resistance, and therefore they don't know that you can resist. If you don't have ethnic studies on your campuses, I implore you to learn more about ethnic studies. The ethnic studies came because students fought for it. Ethnic studies came because of revolution, that students led protests and sit-ins and marches, and if they could do that in the 1960s, you could do that too, to fight for ethnic studies and to fight for more Filipino American professors. Next. Don't assimilate, navigate. There are going to be lots of times where you might be the only one in the room, and to stay true to yourself, to know that you might need to acculturate to your surroundings, and you might need to learn how to navigate spaces that weren't made for us, but that eventually you can be one of many in the room. And in fact, I implore you all to build your own tables. What I mean by that is if you don't see something that's made for you, then you have to make it. Pamantasan was created because people saw the need for it, so they created it, and here it is 3 decades later. This is the Filipino American Psychological Association, a division of the Asian American Psychological Association. It started because my compadre E.J. David and I realized that there were so few Filipinos in the Asian American Psychological Association. So we created this division, which now has hundreds of members. So if you think that something needs to be created, that you can do so. This is the LGBTQ Scholars of Color Network. I realize that there are very few spaces in academia for queer and trans people of color. So we created the table, and now hundreds of people are now part of the organization. Practice self-care. You can do yoga, you can go running, you can go for a walk. I don't like to do any of those things, but you need to take care of yourself. You are only as strong as you are healthy. And so to make sure that you take care of yourself so that you can be an activist and a revolutionary. Be an activist and be an accomplice too. Being an activist is what we need to do to ensure that justice is always integrated into every aspect of our lives. As Alice Walker says, activism is my rent for living on the planet. If it's not you, then who? We also need to learn how to be accomplices or allies, people who fight for social justice, even if it's not our cause. And so when I think about what's happening on the mountain a few hours away, for us to realize as Filipinos that we have also been a colonized people whose land has been taken from us, whose cultures have been taken from us, and we need to support and promote indigeneity as much as we possibly can. Next slide. Number 7 is know where you belong. Know that you have a seat at the table. If you ever feel what we call imposter phenomenon, that you feel you're an imposter and you don't deserve to be somewhere, I want you to check yourself. and to say that you do belong there. You belong everywhere that you are, even if people make you to feel as if you're not. And again, if you don't make that effort to be in those spaces, then who will? And so know your place, know that you do belong in every space that you're in, and use your voice. No one knows what you're thinking unless you say it out loud. And so when you are at spaces where you are the only Filipino or the only person of color or the only queer person, use that voice because that's how people will actually know what your perspectives are. Finally, remember the manongs and manangs. Remember the ancestors. Remember the people that fought for you to get to where you are today. I recognize that people literally put their lives on the line for me to be where I am today. People fought for the right to exist and the right for independence and freedom so that we can be where we are today. People endured discrimination like this, where people were extremely and explicitly racist towards Filipino Americans. And so it is not just, a possibility of us fighting for social justice. It is our responsibility to fight for social justice. Because if our manongs and manangs could put their lives on the line so that we can have the freedoms that we have today, that it is our responsibility to make sure that we make the world a little bit better for future generations. And finally, I just want to acknowledge that when you are navigating life, that it can often feel like you're alone and you feel as if you can't do it, or you feel like you're tired and you're exhausted, and you get beat down so much. And what I encourage you to always remember is that you are your ancestors' wildest dreams, that your people come from a lineage of people who were revolutionaries. Your people were people who fought against colonialism until the Philippines had their freedom. You're descendants of Lapu-Lapu, who killed Ferdinand Magellan after he said, "We're tired of this ish and we're not going to do this anymore." You are descendants of Gabriela Silang, who fought for independence and freedom. You are descendants of a long lineage of Filipino Americans who have used their voice, have operated collectively and built coalitions with other communities so that our people's voices would be heard. So don't ever forget that you have so much possibility and strength, and especially strength in numbers. And to remember you are your ancestors' wildest dreams, and to remember that being Filipino means that you can do anything. So thank you very much. Mahalo, salamat, sayamat.